All right, so this video now, we're going to take what we did in the previous video where it was all these different trig identities and how can we rewrite things. Now we actually want to use that stuff. All right, so I've got this function cotangent. I'm going to multiply it to sine. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and represent some of these functions. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at that cotangent. I can represent that using two different methods. I can use the reciprocal, 1 over tangent, or I can use the quotient, cosine over sine. One of these is going to be much more beneficial to use than the other one. The one that I know that is going to be much more beneficial is that cosine divided by sine. And here's why. So if I rewrite cotangent as cosine divided by sine, then I'm going to multiply that by this other sine function. Really what I'm doing is I'm multiplying two fractions. So when I multiply my fractions, you multiply your numerators together. That gets you cosine times sine, all over the multiplication of my denominators. Sine times 1 is just sine. Now what I notice is that I have a sine being divided by itself. Sine over sine. Those divide out, and I'm just left with cosine. So the beneficial one was the cosine divided by sine, that quotient identity, not the reciprocal identity. So this is us just getting practice and us getting used to using these different types of identities. Let's move on to another one. So now I've got the cosine, and I'm dividing it by cotangent. So I'm using this cotangent function again. Once again, I'm going to show you how to represent cotangent using two different ways. So I can represent cotangent as my reciprocal identity, 1 over tangent, or my quotient identity, cosine over sine. I'm going to use the cosine over sine. You're going to see why. Why would I pick that one? Why is that going to be much more beneficial? Because once again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to rewrite these things. We're trying to kind of like simplify. Right? So I'm going to take this cosine. Instead of dividing it by cotangent, I'm going to divide it by its quotient identity, which is cosine over sine. All right, so now what I'm going to do, I don't like the way that's written. Now, we know how to be able to rewrite this stuff, so instead of dividing by that fraction, dividing by that denominator, I'm going to multiply it by its reciprocal. So cosine is going to get multiplied by the reciprocal of that bottom denominator, which becomes sine over cosine. So now I'm multiplying two fractions together. So my numerator becomes cosine times sine, and my denominator is just cosine. This is why it was beneficial to use that quotient identity at the very beginning. So instead of me writing it as cotangent, I decided let's write this as cosine over sine. These cosines in my numerator and my denominator right now will divide out. So I'm just left with sine. All right, so let me go back to that really quick, to that previous. All right, so you can see that we need to be able to identify. There's lots of ways to represent these different types of functions. We got to pick the one that's going to be most beneficial for us to use. So we wanted to practice, hey, how can I rewrite? How can I rewrite? How can I rewrite? Okay, now which one do I want to pick? All right, and that's what we're going to do in this next one. So I've got a sine squared. I'm going to multiply it by a cotangent squared. Now remember when we started to work with this stuff, my suggestion was always, can we rewrite stuff in terms of a sine and a cosine? That might help us out a lot. All right, so I have a sine squared and I have a cotangent squared. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this cotangent, all right, and I'm going to try and rewrite that. Now there's actually three ways that we can represent this. One, as a reciprocal identity, which is going to be written right here, 1 over my tangent squared. That's my reciprocal identity. 2, my second way is going to be using my quotient identity, which would be cosine squared over sine squared. So that's 2 of my 3 ways. Now, there is a third way. The reason there's a third way is because I have a squared. That's a Pythagorean identity. So remember, cotangent is my one coat in a closet. And all I'm doing is I'm trying to solve for my cosecant. Solve for my cotangent. So this is a third way that I can actually represent that same information. All right, cosecant squared minus 1. So I'm using my Pythagorean identity from previous ones, right, to be able to help me out with this. Right? Now, there's 3 up here to choose from. Which one's going to be most beneficial? I'm looking at that cosine squared over sine squared. I'm looking at my quotient identity. All right, and this is why. I've got my first sine squared. Now I'm going to multiply it by cotangent, or my cotangent squared. Remember, we're going to rewrite that. We're going to rewrite that as cosine squared over sine squared. All right. Now I've got 2 fractions being multiplied, so I'm going to rewrite my numerator. I'm going to rewrite my denominator. Now if you see, I have a sine squared being divided by itself. That cancels out to 1. That divides out to 1, and I'm just left with cosine. Cosine squared theta. All right, so we have to try and determine which one is going to be the most beneficial for us to use. All right, which one's going to be the most beneficial for us to work with? Right? And I really like to be able to represent all three ways. If you have a Pythagorean identity, you can rewrite it one of three ways. You're going to choose one of those three ways. And then you just have to keep practicing, keep working with it over and over and over again. You're going to get better.